This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Absolutely lovely to see you all, and it's fantastic to sit like this and to be able to take everybody in. I sometimes have given talks with minimal notes, but tonight, and I have given this talk once before in Buddhafield, I'm actually going to do it written down because it's a hard story to tell, and I just thought that to make sure that I choose the choice words that I've sort of got it as is. But I will try and it will still be me. I kind of put this together, and it's my story describing probably the hardest day of my life. I'll begin. Touching the void, a catastrophic fall into heart. We're healed of a suffering only by experiencing it to the full. We're healed of a suffering only by experiencing it to the full. It popped up on my daily meditation app. I winced, but nevertheless swallow up what I fear to be another mawkish quote preceding my digital Tibetan bells. In this case, the quote was from Marcel Proust. I confess I've never read him, but knew of Swann's remembrance of things past, his vivid reminiscence triggered by tasting a Madeleine cake. What did he mean? We're healed of a suffering only by experiencing it to the full. I had to delve and discovered it to come from the 6th of his 7-part semi-autobiographical novel, In Search of Lost Time. Proust was describing the feelings of a jilted lover, Charles Swann. I recall the character played by Jeremy Irons in the 1980s film. Swann's lover, Albertine, leaves him for another. She then inconveniently dies. Swann continues to suffer from punishing jealousy, obsession, and loss. He's tormented by her infidelities and a total inability to control her. Such destructive ruminations persist even following her death. A jilted lover? Not an altogether uncommon story. So why my interest? I'll come back to this later. Now, for a different story, my story. My story is about suffering and how it might help us to see things more clearly, as they really are, rather than as we would like them to be. If I'm successful, this story applies to you. In my case, it's about finding heart. So here goes. Touching the void, a catastrophic fall into heart. Tor Aotearoa. In February 2020, I'd taken a long holiday from my job as a respiratory consultant in my local hospital in Bath. I was celebrating my 60th birthday and retirement by cycling Tor Aotearoa, literally a tour of New Zealand. A 3,000 kilometre cycle ride from its most northerly tip in the North Island, Cape Reinga, and to its most southern tip, and it's a 100-mile beach to its most southerly tip in the South Island, Bluff. I've been a super keen cyclist, not a racer as such, but had done a couple of long Ironman events, triathlons, more for accomplishment rather than competition. I adored my cycling, and my partner and I had cycled Britain, Ireland, France end to end, plus some other long distances in Europe and Vietnam. I had 4 bicycles, lovers, a commuter, a carbon tourer with electronic gear shifts, a foldable Brompton for the train, and last but not least, my Thorn Nomad expedition bike, the new Mark III. It was the first off the factory line, a heavy, lumbering steel machine with an indestructible roll-off hub gear fit for a round-the-world bike tour. I quite fancied that. Anyway, I set off along a 100-mile beach with a New Zealand friend and his 4 mates. They were just a bit too quick for me, and I was keen to blog my trip, crafting and posting a narrated photojournal each day. So there I was, 1,000 kilometres and 8 days in, travelling alone and heading south on a track deep into the bush towards a bridge to nowhere. There was some time pressure to make a jet boat crossing at the Wanganui River, and I left at dawn. I met many delightful fellow cyclists along the way, including a Kiwi, Arthur, who was cycling just ahead of me, as well as an Aussie couple with whom I chatted with the night before. I presumed they were behind me. They'd been particularly impressed by my Thorn Nomad and its indestructible gear hub. By coincidence, I'd photographed. Mustn't do a Boris Johnson mistake here. I'd photographed the 2 new levers on our first cycle day at Cape Reingi Lighthouse, a chance encounter between us from any of 1,000 cyclists attempting this end-to-end trip that fortnight. People had warned of the difficulties of this particular track. Appallingly, someone had fallen and died the year before, and the Department of Conservation, DOC, had marked a portion of the track with safety signage, but several kilometres into the bush, our breve, the colloquial term for a bevy of end-to-end New Zealand cyclists, were all being tracked using a Spot Gen 3 GPS satellite system. If you had internet, you could watch a tiny dot called Vajrin making an ant-like trail towards his unbeknown void. Blind to my future, I was loving this risky endeavour. I felt that I was going forth from urban comfort into the wild, at least for 3 weeks. A catastrophic fall and touching the void. Progressing to reach a bridge to nowhere in time, I remember a relatively easy path unexpectedly presenting itself as downward sloping where I'd anticipated climbing. I think the ground was muddy and others may have previously churned the surface. I was too fast and perhaps skidded. Perhaps my inertia threw me forward and over to one side of my beloved Nomad. I put my hand out, presuming to push against a firm bank covered with low-lying bush. Instead, there was void. I touched what I imagined to be terra firma, but I simply slipped through. Alice falling through a mirror. Back of a wardrobe. Not firm, but leaves, then nothing. Falling. I was fully attentive to that moment. I can see and feel it now, the sense of touching space. Proust rightly says that time and memory alter our perception of things past. So, I don't fully trust my memory, but for now, it feels palpably true. And I whooshed and landed with the biggest thump I'd ever known. No loss of consciousness. No pain at the time, but a tingling below my trunk. My legs were weightless and floating in a sea of sizzling fizz. Being a doctor of 35 years standing, I knew straight away that I was paralysed. I lay face down and, although able to breathe, calling out was greatly diminished. I lay there waiting. Time lingered. Vajrin, could you hear me? My reply was impassioned but hopelessly weak. I heard further conversation and some time later, Mark, one of the Aussie couple, was at my side. Here he is. Soon, Vanessa was at my head, a soothing presence. All's going to be okay. How amazingly strong you are. How well you're doing. I hardly knew her, but she was Tara, a compassionate saviouress, ferrying me to safety. The Taranaki rescue helicopter crew needed to land a kilometre away and walk in, bearing a stretcher. My neck and body were stabilised, and I was hoisted. The helicopter flew, refuelled, and flew again, arriving at Middlemore, a major trauma hospital in South Auckland. My higgledy-piggledy memory recalled a trauma workup, a humming CT gantry, capturing images of my cracked spine, a nipple-high T45 fracture, and subluxation. This word, subluxation, meant that the two vertebral bones had slipped over each other, mangling my spinal cord and causing a paralysis high up my chest. Paraplegia, to give its full name. In my case, I had full arm function, but nothing below other than a sizzling fizz. I'd fallen 20 metres into a gorge, landing face down, softer ground catching my fall. Mark told me that I was only centimetres away from a rock. I'd smashed my back, ribs, both wrists, but luckily head and neck were fine. The Middlemore surgeon told me that falling half this height was associated with a 50% mortality. I was jammy, to say the least. A weird thought, given my existing predicament. Will I improve? It was very mangled. I surmised no. Even now, I feel the same sizzling fizz as the time I landed. I also have ghost feelings in my legs. My sense is that they are placed in one position, but a visual reality check refutes my sense of joint position. Sometimes a leg, unbeknown until I check, is hanging out of the bed. Duolingo in intensive care. It had been a very long day, a pre-dawn rise heading for a bridge to nowhere, a catastrophic fall, a soothing voice ferrying me to safety, a helicopter and a lengthy ride, a hospital trauma protocol. I woke up in intensive care after 5 hours of intricate surgery, repositioning and fixing my dislocated spine. The day was not yet done. Unnecessarily catastrophizing, I told my partner I would never sit up again. Kathy heeled over and was stretchered down to casualty. They diagnosed a faint from shock, and she recovered, returning to my side. It was late. It had been a very long day. At which point I asked, "What time is it?" 11:45. "Can you give me my phone?" "Yes, but why do you want it?" "I need to do my Duolingo." At this stage, I held a 2-year-long streak in Spanish. Oh, I was blowed if I was going to lose it. Further bad things ensued that year. A global pandemic meant I was to be stranded in New Zealand for 4 months. My career as a clinician came to an end. I'd lost permanent use of my legs. Worse still, I gained 30 kilograms in weight during the second year of my injury due to a mixture of comfort eating, inability to be weighed, no wheelchair scales in the community, and an exercise regime shifting from massive to nil. Even worse still, new neurology threatened the loss of my arms and perhaps death. I would need 4 further operations over a 10-month period. But my Spanish Duolingo streak, or better put, una racha, remained intact and is now, at the time of writing, on its 6th year. So something about me. It's interesting what we cling to. In my life, I've been a bit of a clinger, systematising and structuring to achieve order and accrue goals. I threw myself at medical exams, utilising excessive overlearning to manage childhood dyslexia. I sweated my way through a science PhD, examining TB vaccine design. I ran 5 marathons, my first in London, where I collapsed at the finishing line with crippling cramp. Some weeks later, I found I'd made the Daily Mail photo finish. Not really the one I wanted. Me laid out on a stretcher, oxygen cylinder, and paramedic in attendance. In my quest for acquisition, I'd meditated pretty well every day for a 20-year stretch. Surely that must add up to something. However, despite my attempt at spiritual procurement, I felt thwarted, cheated even. Where was my mindfulness? Where was my capacity to respond to adversity? Why couldn't I utilise higher states of concentration to help me with my burden? At the time, it all seemed pretty useless. More later. A professor's dream. I was discharged from Middlemore Trauma Hospital to Auckland Spinal Unit in June 2020. Got that month wrong. March 2020. I was just March 2020. Trapped by the pandemic for 4 months, they eventually medevaced me to Salisbury Spinal Unit, just over an hour from my home. So to get the dates right, it was March I was in the spinal unit in New Zealand, and June I moved to Salisbury. The spinal unit was linked to Salisbury District General Hospital, and it was in full lockdown. New Zealand, in stark contrast, had been so successful at eradicating COVID. The Kiwis were out and about, sports arenas full, restaurants hectic. The rest of the world remained behind closed doors. In Salisbury, I developed a strange neurological complication affecting the upper part of my chest and arms. A specific area tingled somewhat disagreeably. Then, every 10 days or so, it moved upwards. Slowly ascending, 1 vertebra level at a time, an inexorable rostral creep, following the pattern of my erstwhile study of neuroanatomy, dermatome by dermatome, chest to arm, arm to hand, marching a path to my neck and face. An MRI scan of my spinal cord showed bizarre swelling. Nobody knew what it was. Later, a Bristol neurosurgeon said it was a bit like spam. Not the Monty Python spam, but subacute ascending myelopathy, a rare condition usually occurring within the first 2 weeks of injury. Another spinal unit, Stoke Mandeville, the National Spinal Injury Centre, had seen a handful of cases and contributed a report adding to the 70-odd cases in the world literature. They recommended an esteemed neurosurgeon, Professor Papadopoulos, at St George's Hospital, Tooting. Initially, the professor wasn't going to operate. He'd reviewed my MRI scans from Salisbury and Bath. There was no syrinx, a central fluid-filled cavity within the spinal cord. Just an opacity on the MRI scan, in keeping with these rare cases of spam. What was his rationale for surgery? He'd never operated on such a case before. No syrinx, no loss of strength in my arms, a clinical feature of syringomyelia. No, he wouldn't operate. Rather than reply to my GP that day, he slept on it. In his sleep, he dreamt. In his dream, a neuroradiologist materialised and explained the scans. Above the level of the original injury, there were flow artefacts, otherwise known as signal voids. However, below, the voids were absent. Why should this matter? Bear with me. To understand this, it's important to understand the anatomy of the spinal cord and the cause of the artefact. The cord, a thick cable of neurons, is bathed in cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, and held within a robust tube, the dura. The signal void, a dark area on the scan, is due to an artefact created by pulsatile CSF flow. In the dream, it all became clear. No signal void below, but signal void above. These had to be two separate fluid compartments. Everything fell into place. He knew what to do and phoned me first thing in the morning. What was the significance of the dream? From a psychological perspective, it might simply represent the working of the unconscious mind, weaving together available data into a single coherent explanation. James Watson, of Crick and Watson, dreamt of a spiral staircase prior to their elucidation of the double helical structure of DNA. However, I prefer a more poetic explanation. When I told the team I was keen to write a book, the surgical registrar, Florence, said that the whole story sounded a bit too woo-woo, and she was keen that her boss was seen as a serious scientist. I'd still like to imagine divine intervention. In one narrative, the visitor is Asclepius, close to the homeland of our Professor Papadopoulos. Asclepius, an ancient Greek demigod, was the son of Apollo and trained by Chiron, the centaur, in the art of healing. That night, Asclepius appeared to the professor, manifesting somewhat unusually as a neuroradiologist. Asclepius, master of healing, outsurpassing his mentor Chiron, highlighted the importance of the MRI signal voids, reminding the professor of what he already knew. The clue was in flow. Flow above, no flow below, suggesting that the spinal cord was tethered or stuck down to its surrounding, the dura. The surgical solution lay in untethering and regaining flow. He knew what to do. Asclepius vanished and Professor Papadopoulos awoke. A eureka moment. Surgery was fantastically successful, with a resolution of my weird arms symptoms and a neck MRI returning to near normal. Sadly, the awful symptoms returned 6 weeks later, that October. 2 further operations seemed to work, but the benefit was only temporary. It was now December, 10 months after my fall. I was back at home, now encamped in the dining room, a place only previously entered for Christmas lunches, the occasional dinner party, children's homework, and my previous flirtation with the piano. Now, a commandeered makeshift bedroom. Imagine the scene: an oversized polished wooden mantelpiece framing green miniaturized London Underground tiles and a 1911 fireplace. The walls, ointment pink, matched a watercolour of a sombre, pregnant lady, modern but reminiscent of Lautrec. My hospital bed, now a wartime requisite, replaced a round dining table. Severe lightning pains came to me during the night, shooting up to my neck. My wife and son hearing me screech, a fox trapped in the house. The MRI showed that things were grim. The swelling had ascended to my hindbrain at the top of my spinal cord. 3 operations had failed to stem the ascending onslaught. I was toast, or so I imagined. Fortunately, and you know it's fortunately, a final operation saved the day. He removed all the metalwork around my now healed spinal fracture and made more space for CSF flow. It's been over 3 years with no recurrence. However, as a memento, I'm left with a painful, tingly left arm, adding to the sizzling fizz below. St. George's Academic Neurosurgical wrote up the first case of CRAM, not SPAM, a new description for chronic relapsing ascending myelopathy, my neologism, and also a nod to my running hero, Steve Cram. 40 years of practice. At the outset, I said that the story was relevant to you. How so? Spinal cord injury is very much less likely to happen to you. There are only about 4,400 cases a year in the UK. Mortality from cancer is 40 times more frequent, not to mention deaths from vascular disease such as stroke or heart disorder. However, such an incident should remind us that disease, injury, old age and death are too easily put to the back of our minds. When such a fate befalls us, or befalls someone dear to us, how prepared are we? How prepared was I after my 40 years of Buddhist practice, regular meditation, study of Buddhist principle, retreats, and regular contact with Sangha, my Buddhist community? Initially, my response to the events, using a medical jargon here, I was very pissed off. I was not able to absorb the experience mindfully or with any insight. I felt often weak, tearful, and unable to see where the Buddhist teaching had taken me. Mindfulness and higher states of concentration were not really there for me. However, there's always a however. Reflecting on my grueling year, my 4 decades of Buddhist practice had, I believe, given me something very special, a heart of love. Apologies if this sounds trite or formulaic. I don't want it to. But I do want to convey a sense, little by little, step by step, of an unfolding heart. A heart more open to the world. In Buddhist terms, this had manifested as love, or metta. I realised that I had overwhelming appreciation and gratitude to my carers, to my wife Kathy, my family, friends, and all those who showed such incredible kindness and support. Some more relevant jargon: in Buddhist terms, this gratitude and appreciation is called mudita, or sympathetic joy. In addition, my Kissa Gotami moment in Auckland Hospital with my tetraplegic roommates unable to use their hands and me ruminating about my own loss, I felt compassion, or karuna. As a doctor and a scientist, I can't be certain that this opening of the heart has been due to practice, but I believe it to be very likely. I also believe in the concept of post-traumatic growth, where some who have experienced trauma can grow out of such an experience. I profess no great advancement, but I do claim something. Since my injury, I've had to manage loss of being a runner, loss of cycling, loss of exploring wild places. However, in a strange way, I've opened up to the world in a way I didn't expect. Despite my sciencey scepticism, I tried acupuncture for the first time, psychotherapy for the first time, a lovely approach called PARTS, or internal family system therapy. After some years of braving my loss with a perceived smiling forbearance, I've opened up to a fuller range of emotion. For the first time this year, I experienced floods of tears. First hearing my daughter discuss plans to run her very first half marathon. Then, only a few months ago, I saw hordes of cyclists in Mallorca. On encountering them, I wept and wept and wept. Overall, I suspect that this understanding, this grief flooding in, has been beneficial. I think since my injury, I'm more appreciative, not only of those in my sphere, but also strangers I cross paths with. I'm also more appreciative of the world around me. Birdsong, a fine copper beach in a neighbour's garden, a higgledy-piggledy beds of flowers at a retreat centre. I've managed 2 retreats this year already, the second independent of a carer. My gratitude feels immense, especially to all those who supported me. I had a very special connection with a large, empathetic WhatsApp group. Sounds like an oxymoron. Straddling the UK and New Zealand during lockdown, populated by beautiful songs recorded by a friend, Denise. My gratitude extends to all the nurses, doctors, therapists, healthcare assistants, including a bonkers porter telling me about zombie ants. I believe that now I'm more curious and more willing to accept that I do not know. I promised I'd return to Swan and the Marcel Proust quote. We are all healed of a suffering only by experiencing it to the full. In the story, Swan realises that much of his anguish has been due to his idealised memories, not the realities of the moment. In his case, his storytelling culminated in an obsessive jealousy and an inability to control life as it actually was. Much of his pain was based on his self-created, elaborate and elusive world. However, on reflection, he makes an honest appraisal of how things actually are, warts and all, so to speak. This led to a resolution. So, I now need to come back to my title, Touching the Void, a Catastrophic Fall into Heart, and unpack this a little more. There are some obvious allusions to Touching the Void. First, Joe Simpson's famous autobiography of that name, describing a disastrous fall a near-death experience when he was climbing in a remote region of South America. Highly recommend if you've not read it. Another illusion describes that feeling of my fall through the looking glass foliage, touching the empty space where I expected firm ground. Also, I'm reminded of Professor Papadopoulos' dream and his signal voids. But I also suggest that touching the void has another meaning. The word void is less good, but an emotionally evocative translation of the Buddhist word shunyata, perhaps better understood as emptiness. Apologies, I'm no expert in this area, but I can give you a flavour of this as the word void crops up in the Heart Sutra, regularly chanted by Buddhist communities across the world, as follows. All things are by nature void. They are not born or destroyed, nor are they stained or pure, nor do they wax or wane. So, in emptiness, no form, no feeling, thought, or choice, nor is there consciousness. You can hear a string of negations, a poetic entreaty with the intention of pointing to something beyond the mundane. So what does it mean to touch the void? I suggest a flavour of insight into how things actually are, rather than how we would like them to be. A brutally honest reality. We are healed of a suffering only by experiencing it to the full. Bruce Swan is healed of a suffering by experiencing reality rather than his idealised reconstruction of it. In my case, I cannot say that I have been fully healed of a suffering. However, it still holds a strong resonance, and I think I am at least partly healed of a suffering. This has been supported by being able to experience myself more deeply. I've had to face up to my acquisitional approach to life, acquiring my badges along the way, a hospital specialist, director of medical education, an Iron Man, my ordination into Triratna Buddhist community, a meditator with a 20-year streak, a Spanish Duolingo practitioner with a 6-year streak. These things appear commendable, but they've revealed themselves as ultimately unsatisfactory. In my catastrophic fall, my possessions, my badges of commendation, failed to satisfy. There was no special mindfulness, no exquisite Vulcan mind control to assuage the pain. However, I do believe that my practice of meditation, practice of Buddhism, nevertheless was much more useful than I imagined. In my case, it brought me closer to a heartfelt experience of gratitude and appreciation, a deep love, connection with people, a wonderment and curiosity about our natural world, an opening up into new emotional rivulets, my catastrophic fall into heart. I'd like to close with some writing from my time in hospital during our COVID lockdown. This was after 4 months. 8th of July 2020, day 133. A bridge. Tonight my old school flatmates and I played online bridge. It was a lot of fun. My bridge was horribly rusty, the problem accentuated by my finger accidentally tapping 6 of diamonds when I meant to hit pass. We had the minority of points and minority of diamonds. For those not familiar with the game, this would be akin to Andorra declaring war on Russia. The bridge programme didn't allow a bid to be retracted, and my friend, Tippy, genial in all other respects, ruthlessly doubled the contract. The outcome wasn't good for Andorra, despite its cheap vodka. Every day since March the 7th, 9 days after my accident, I've written this diary. This has been completed on my iPhone using a combination of voice recognition and my right thumb. I pushed myself to write something real-time, plus some morning editing, in order to try and capture a particular moment, reflection or feeling. Sometimes I've been fascinated by a topic such as COVID-19 immunity, sometimes shattered by grief, frequently ill, multiple urine infections, inexplicable fever, and latterly new neurology. Always something written. In writing, I recognise its therapeutic value, especially during dark times. I've also wanted to tell this story for you, the reader, in order to describe a personal passage with the intention of a wider applicability. Although exquisitely painful at times, I hope it's also a bridge from despair to acceptance, disability to life, a crossing over to another shore and a new land. On the day of my injury, I was rushing to a bridge to nowhere, a post-war 1930s Ozymandian edifice, long time neglected in the midst of the bush, now reconnected as part of the Wanganui National Park. Its post-World War I intention was to create a link between civilization and the Mangaparua Valley Soldier Settlement. The road was never completed, the settlement abandoned, and the bridge, an isolated construction, subsumed into the forest. Ironically, it's now visited frequently by many walkers and cyclists. Sadly, not this one. Nevertheless, the metaphor of a bridge feels about right. A bridge from despair to acceptance, disability to life, a crossing over to another shore and a new land.
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.